Not every miracle happens on a church stage. Sometimes it's sitting on a sidewalk with the smell of the streets, an unshaven face, and a torn Bible resting on his lap. If someone told you that a successful businesswoman gave up her high-powered life to marry a homeless man, would you believe it? Maybe you'd call it crazy. But what the world sees as absurd is often exactly where God reveals his most powerful grace. My name is Annie Vaughn. I'm 43 years old, from Denver, Colorado, and I run a marketing company with my best friend. My life used to revolve around goals, deadlines, and expensive coffee. But none of that prepared me for what would truly change my life: an unexpected encounter in an unexpected place with someone no one seemed to value. What the world had thrown away, God helped me see with new eyes, and that changed everything. In this story, you'll discover how a simple yes to God can unleash a wave of purpose. You'll see why loving someone has nothing to do with looks, resumes, or status, and everything to do with obedience. And maybe, like I did, you'll realize that God's answer for your life might be hidden in the very place you least want to look. On the outside, my life looked like one of those success stories you see in glossy magazines: sleek office, meetings with CEOs, contracts sealed with a simple handshake. In Denver, my marketing company was thriving, and I ran it alongside my best friend and business partner, Grace. We were great at selling dreams, just not our own. Talking about goals came easy. What was hard was slowing down long enough to hear what God was trying to say in the middle of it all. I was proud of the woman I had become: strong, strategic, respected, but somewhere between pitch meetings and booked flights, I had lost track of my soul. My schedule was packed, but my heart, empty. We often think that overcoming with God is only for people at rock bottom. But let me tell you something I've learned. Sometimes rock bottom looks like a luxury office with a beautiful view and absolutely no peace on the inside. Of course, I didn't realize this all at once. The faith story I'm about to tell didn't begin with some big tragedy. It started with a quiet discomfort, a kind of silence that made noise on the inside. Have you ever had that feeling like something's wrong, but I don't know what? That's exactly where things started to unravel, right at the point where I thought I had everything under control. And that's where the most unexpected part of this story begins. Over time, my daily routine turned into a kind of autopilot disguised as productivity. I'd wake up early, reply to emails before even having coffee, work out of obligation, juggle 1,000 tasks at once, and still smile in meetings like everything was fine. But deep down, my soul was crying for help. It's a strange thing, realizing you've become highly efficient, but emotionally absent. Like you left God in the parking lot the day your first success took off. Each day started to feel the same. Goals, deadlines, clients, numbers. I had become great at solving everyone else's problems, yet completely incapable of facing my own. My faith, which once burned like a living fire, had faded into a dying ember, buried beneath spreadsheets and slide decks. And the hardest part? No one noticed, because the world claps for performance, but doesn't care about burnout. That's when I started to understand something deep. Real breakthrough with God often requires stopping before trying to move forward. I remember one day I sat on the couch with the TV on, my phone buzzing beside me, and I just broke down in tears for no specific reason, or maybe for all the reasons I'd been ignoring. I cried because I had pushed my spirit aside, because I had drifted so far from who I was in God. Sometimes the greatest testimonies of faith begin in silence, in tears and emptiness. And in that moment, without even realizing it, I was being prepared for an encounter that would change everything. That day started like any other. I left work a little later than usual, tired and slightly annoyed by a last-minute problem. Traffic was a mess, and Waze suggested a detour I had never taken before. I hesitated, but turned left, like someone accepting an unexpected invitation. And it was in that very shift in direction that God began to change the course of my story. Because sometimes breakthrough with God begins with a turn that seems ordinary, but leads to an eternal destination. I drove through streets that weren't part of my usual routine. The city felt different, and the quiet between stoplights gave space for something inside me to breathe. When I stopped at a red light near an old, abandoned coffee shop, something caught my eye. There was a man sitting on the ground, alone. But it wasn't just his appearance that held me. It was what I felt when I looked at him. It was like time paused and God whispered, "Look again, daughter." I could have just kept driving, like I always did. But something, or someone, made me linger on that moment. I didn't know it yet, but that simple scene, in that forgotten corner of the city, would become the beginning of one of the greatest faith stories of my life. And even without understanding, my heart began to beat differently. It felt like heaven was gently pushing me out of my comfort zone and straight into my next step. I can't fully explain it, but there was something in his eyes that completely disarmed me. He didn't look away when he saw me. Quite the opposite. He looked straight at me with a calm kind of strength, like he had known me for years. And that shook me. I expected to see mistrust, pain, maybe even anger. But instead, I saw peace. A strange kind of peace for someone in such deep poverty. In that moment, I felt it, deep in my soul, that God was trying to show me something right there, something my natural eyes would never see on their own. It felt like a scene straight out of a parable. A man dirty and worn, covered in tattered clothes, but with eyes that were clear. Clear in the way only someone who carries faith can be. It was as if he had already forgiven life for everything it had taken from him. His eyes spoke, and what they said was something like, "I still believe." How could someone in that condition still hold on to hope? That hit me in a way that no corporate boardroom ever had. My eyes filled with tears, and without fully understanding why, I felt this sudden urge to step out of the car. But I didn't. I just sat there, watching, like someone at the start of a movie, not yet knowing the plot. What I didn't know was that this man, whose name I didn't even know yet, would become the instrument God would use to turn my sleepy faith completely upside down. I just had no idea what was still ahead. The next day, I took the same route again. I'll admit, part of me just wanted to be sure I hadn't imagined it all. And there he was, in the same spot, sitting down, eyes closed. But this time, something made me stop the car and roll down the window. That's when I heard it. He was praying out loud with simple words, but so deep they seemed to go straight to my spirit. And the most surprising part, he was giving thanks, thanking God for another day, for the sunlight, for breath in his lungs. I sat there in silence, listening to that prayer like someone hearing a song they don't understand, but still feel deeply moved by. I had everything, yet I was always complaining, and there he was, worshiping God from the sidewalk. That's when I started to realize something. Breakthrough with God isn't about where you are physically, it's about where your soul chooses to dwell. And that man, still a stranger to me, was already living somewhere else, at the altar of God's presence. I went home restless. That prayer had pierced straight through me. You know that moment when you realize that for all your knowledge, you still haven't grasped the basics? He prayed like he was talking to a close friend, and me, with my well-managed life, felt miles away from that kind of intimacy. It exposed me, it humbled me, but it also drew me in, because what I saw in him was a living faith, not loud, but quietly whispering something I could no longer ignore. I went home that day carrying what felt like an invisible weight. It was as if God had turned on a bright light in a corner of my soul I had been avoiding. But the light wasn't there to accuse me, it was there to reveal me. It showed me that despite all my success, I was empty. That I knew God's name, but had forgotten his voice. That man's prayer didn't leave me in peace. It unsettled me in a holy way, a discomfort that came straight from heaven. No matter how hard I tried to return to my routine, something inside me had shifted. Emails felt less urgent, appointments lost their shine. I was overtaken by a spiritual restlessness that wouldn't let up. I remembered a phrase I'd heard years ago. If your faith never makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's not alive. And there I was, feeling that discomfort pulsing loud and clear. It was God calling me back, using a homeless man as his messenger. That week was hard. I barely slept, overthought everything. I kept wondering if I was just being dramatic. But every time I tried to shake it off, something would pull me right back to that moment. And let me tell you, if you've ever felt this kind of unrest, you know what I mean. It's like God is knocking, patiently, persistently. That's when I realized this discomfort wasn't guilt. It was an invitation to a new journey of faith and breakthrough with God. And I was just about ready to say yes. A few days later, without really planning it, I found myself back at that same spot. My heart was racing, like I was about to reconnect with a part of myself I had lost. And there he was again. Micah, as I learned that day his name was. Sitting in the same corner, now with a worn-out blanket over his shoulders and an open Bible in his lap. Once again, I felt undone. You know that feeling when something seems more familiar than it should? It felt like I was coming home. This time, I had the courage to get out of the car. I walked over slowly and awkwardly started a conversation. He smiled, like he had known all along I'd come back. And then he started talking about the Word, in a way few preachers ever have. He quoted scripture with precision, but what struck me most was his tone. It wasn't pride, it was reverence. It was as if he had a kind of closeness with God that many never experience. There he was, sitting on the street, dirty and invisible to the world, yet full of wisdom. I stayed there for over an hour. I listened to stories, testimonies, and biblical insights that deeply moved me. And the strange thing is, even without meaning to, I started opening up too. It was like a bridge had been built between two very different worlds, both thirsty for the same truth. This wasn't just a meeting, it was the beginning of something much bigger. And I was starting to realize that this journey of breakthrough with God wasn't just his story, it was ours. When I told Grace about Micah, her eyes widened like I had just said I was giving everything up to live in the desert. She listened with that mix of concern and disbelief in her eyes. "Are you okay, Annie?" That was the first thing she asked. And I understood. In the corporate world we lived in, this sounded insane. A successful businesswoman getting involved with a homeless man? It was bound to be a scandal, but it was also a story of faith in the making. Grace tried to warn me about the risks. She said I might be emotionally vulnerable, that I could be getting manipulated, that this whole thing could end badly. And honestly, I don't blame her. From the outside, it did look strange. But on the inside, something was happening that I couldn't even explain. It was like God had turned on a lighthouse in the middle of a sea full of human logic. And even though my mind was screaming, "Be careful," my spirit was whispering, "Keep going." That inner conflict drove me to my knees. I didn't want to lose my friend, but I also couldn't ignore what God was doing. Not everyone will understand when you start living out a true testimony of faith. Sometimes breakthrough with God begins with losing human approval. But in that moment of tension with Grace, I realized something. Obeying God can come at a high cost, but the price of obedience will never outweigh the reward of walking in your purpose. In the middle of that emotional whirlwind, I decided to seek someone who could guide me spiritually. I reached out to Pastor Jonathan Briggs, the leader of the church I've attended for years. He welcomed me with the calm presence of someone who carries wisdom and listened without interrupting. I told him everything: the encounter with Micah, our conversations, the prayer that shook me, and Grace's judgment. I expected him to caution me, maybe even discourage me, but what he said changed everything. "Annie," he said, "sometimes God leads us down paths that make no sense to human logic, just to show us that he sees what no one else does." He looked me straight in the eyes and continued, "You're not standing in front of a lost cause. You're standing in front of a valuable soul." Those words hit me deeply. So simple, yet full of discernment, they brought peace to my heart. It felt like God was confirming, through spiritual authority, that what I was sensing wasn't madness, it was divine direction. I walked out of his office with a different posture. That conversation didn't give me all the answers, but it strengthened my conviction. Sometimes breakthrough with God requires us to hear the right voices at the right time. And that day, the right voice came from a pastor who reminded me that Jesus saw lepers, sinners, and fishermen, and called them disciples. Little did I know that invisible disciple I had met on the street was also being prepared by God for something much greater. After that conversation with Pastor Jonathan, I found the courage to take the next step. I invited Micah to have coffee, and he accepted with a shy, polite smile. I chose a quiet coffee shop where he could feel comfortable. There, between warm sips and curious glances from people around us, we started something neither of us could have imagined, a discipleship relationship. And it wasn't just him being taught. God was shaping me too, quietly, in the process. With the church's support, I began walking alongside him more closely. I brought Micah to services, and afterward, we would sit together and talk about the sermons. Each meeting seemed to open more doors in his heart, and in mine. He asked deep questions, and his hunger to know God was inspiring. Watching someone who had lost so much rediscover faith with such passion was one of the greatest testimonies I had ever witnessed. It felt like all of heaven was celebrating every small step forward. It didn't take long for the community to get involved too. Some church members began greeting him, others started including him in their prayers. And I could see it clearly. The one the world labeled homeless, the kingdom was beginning to recognize as a son. Breakthrough with God was unfolding right before my eyes. No glamour, no headlines, but full of power. And with every meeting, every conversation, every prayer, I became more certain. God was writing a brand new story, and I was part of it. It was during one of those conversations that Micah, his eyes fixed on the ground, began to tell me his story. Opening his heart wasn't easy for him, but little by little, the words came, and with them, tears he had been holding back for years. Before the streets, he had been a college professor. He had a loving wife and a daughter with curious eyes, a normal, dignified life, until the day he lost them both in an accident. The grief crushed him, and he simply stopped living. Hearing that left me speechless. It was hard to imagine that this man, marked by time and by the streets, had once lived all of that. He told me about the deep depression, the guilt that consumed him, and the choice to withdraw from everything and everyone. The faith he once had faded, for a time, but it was on cold nights and park benches that he began seeking God again. And that return, he said, was what kept him alive. A testimony of faith that grew out of the darkest grief. That taught me something profound. We never truly know the pain someone carries behind what our eyes can see. Micah wasn't just homeless. He was a wounded father, a grieving husband, a quiet teacher. And by telling me his story, he didn't just trust me, he revealed the miracle God was already working inside him. Breakthrough with God had begun long before I crossed his path, and now I understood I wasn't sent to rescue someone. I was sent to walk alongside him. It was moving to watch Micah start rebuilding his life, not in some spectacular way, but in the subtle details that only someone looking with their heart would notice. He started getting haircuts, shaving, and accepting donations with gratitude, not shame. We replaced his worn-out clothes with new ones, but the real change was in the way he looked at himself in the mirror. The reflection was no longer one of ruin, but of redemption, the kind of transformation that only happens with God. With the help of the church, we were able to get him a small room in a Christian shelter. There he had a bed, a hot shower, and something far more valuable: dignity. And in that space, he rediscovered the joy of reading. I remember the first time I saw him leaning over a theology book with the same spark in his eyes I had seen when he spoke about his daughter. The hunger he once had only for food had become a hunger for knowledge, for growth, for becoming the man God had always known him to be. People began to notice. Church members, shelter neighbors, even my mother commented, "He looks like a different man." But I knew. He wasn't different. He was his true self, the man who had always been there beneath the pain. It was as if God was painting, layer by layer, the image of a restored son, a living testimony of faith, walking the streets of Denver. And as I watched it happen, my own soul was being restored too. What was growing in my heart was more than gratitude. I didn't realize it right away. We never really notice when the heart starts beating to a different rhythm. All I know is that one day, after a long conversation about the book of Romans, I saw him smile, and my heart reacted in a way I couldn't ignore. I felt restless. It wasn't a simple attraction, nor a passing impulse. It was something deeper, more reverent. I began to wonder, how can I admire someone like this? A man the world had thrown away, but whom God had chosen. I tried to ignore it. I hid it, suppressed it, even prayed that it was just emotional confusion. After all, it didn't seem logical for me, a businesswoman, organized, living a normal life, to fall in love with someone who still carried the marks of the streets. But every time Micah shared his experiences with God, every time he reached out to help another homeless person, something inside me melted. I could no longer separate admiration from affection. It was love, and it was pure. That realization threw me into a new kind of conflict. My rational side screamed that this couldn't happen, but my soul, fed daily by this testimony of faith, had already made its choice. And even without saying anything out loud, I knew. Loving Micah wasn't a loss of reason, it was a spiritual confirmation. But embracing that love wouldn't be easy, because the world always has something to say when God's story of redemption doesn't follow the script it expects. For weeks, I lived through a war inside my own heart. I prayed, I fasted, I talked to myself and to God. I was afraid I might be confusing compassion with loneliness, purpose with emotion. Society was telling me one thing, my feelings another. And God was silent. Or at least that's what I thought. Until one night, in the middle of sincere tears, I knelt beside my bed and said, "Lord, if this is your will, speak to me clearly." The next morning, I opened my Bible at random, like someone searching for a sign, and my eyes fell on Isaiah 43:19. "Behold, I am doing a new thing." My heart trembled, and for those who think that's just coincidence, I say it's not. When we are walking through a journey of overcoming with God, He speaks, and He speaks in His own way. From that moment on, the confirmation started to come. In sermons, in random conversations, even in dreams my mother had and shared with me without knowing anything. Those answers didn't erase the fear right away, but they gave me the courage to keep praying and waiting. Because loving someone outside of what's expected takes faith, and faith costs something. Through this process, I learned that a testimony of faith isn't just when God changes someone, it's when He changes our perspective about that person. Micah wasn't a charity project. He was a gift. And accepting that meant accepting that God was writing something greater than any human judgment. Saying yes to God doesn't always mean saying yes to something comfortable. But that day, on a park bench where it all began, I looked into Micah's eyes and told him I loved him. He didn't react like in the movies. He cried. A quiet, grateful, broken kind of cry. He said he didn't feel worthy, that he was still battling many wounds, and that he never imagined someone like me would look at him with such respect. And that's when I understood. The love God plants in us is restorative, not idealized. Of course, that yes came with sideways glances, whispered comments, and even unsolicited advice. Some said I was romanticizing poverty or that it was just an emotional phase. But there were also those who cried with us, who saw God's hand bringing together two broken stories into one shared purpose. Micah, now stronger in his faith and living in a small studio offered by a church member, started to be seen differently. But to me, he had always been a man with purpose. He had just been covered in the dust and rejection of life. Embracing this relationship felt like walking through a rusty iron gate with flowers in my hands. It wasn't easy, but it was beautiful. Our yes wasn't about passion, it was about mission. It was about looking ahead together with courage and faith, knowing that what God joined wasn't just an unlikely couple, it was a covenant of restoration. Two people choosing to live as a living testimony of grace. From that moment on, our story was no longer just mine or his. It became the story of many. Our wedding wasn't glamorous. There were no gold-embossed invitations, no fancy banquet hall. The ceremony took place on a Sunday afternoon, inside the church where Micah had first been welcomed. Pastor Jonathan insisted on keeping everything simple and reverent. The flowers were donated by members of the community. The dress I wore was borrowed from a friend, and yet it was the most beautiful moment of my life. Because before God, what mattered wasn't luxury, it was purpose. Many who were present that day had been touched by the mission that began before we even realized it existed. People Micah had listened to, counseled, and discipled, former homeless individuals, restored families, volunteers, and brothers and sisters in Christ. Grace, my business partner, was there, tears in her eyes, now not from worry, but from pride. My mother, once so hesitant, embraced Micah as a son. Even Troy, the influential client who had become a supporter, gave an emotional testimony about what he saw in us. Love with roots in heaven. When we exchanged our vows, we didn't promise wealth or an easy life. We promised to remain a shelter for one another. We promised to pray before making decisions. We promised to start over as many times as needed. And on that simple altar, with stained glass windows glowing in the sunlight, I understood that marriage is more than two lives becoming one. It's the birth of a shared mission. And so we began a new chapter, not as a fairy tale, but as living proof that God still writes unlikely stories to reveal His love. It didn't take long for us to realize that our marriage wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new mission. Together, we began dreaming of something bigger than our own happiness. That's when God placed in our hearts the idea of opening a shelter. But it wouldn't just be a place with beds and meals. We wanted a home where dignity was restored, where every person was seen and heard as someone with a story, not just another number in the statistics of urban poverty. With the help of our church, donations, and even support from former clients who had come to see my faith in a new light, we rented an old building on the outskirts of Denver. We named it the House of Good News. There, men and women experiencing homelessness received more than just a roof and bread. They received discipleship, someone to truly listen, opportunities, and most importantly, love without judgment. Micah led the Bible studies. I took care of administration and fundraising. And together, we watched lives being healed one by one, like planting trees in soil that once seemed barren. Of course, there were hard days. Some gave up halfway through, others fell back into old patterns. But there were also those who came back years later just to say, "You were the answer to my prayer." Every new name filling a room was another chance to see God at work. Our home became a refuge for others, and it brought us even closer together. We weren't just husband and wife, we were co-workers in grace. And realizing that gave a whole new meaning to the word family. Today, when I look at Micah, I no longer see a man who came from the streets. I see a leader with a gentle yet steady voice, a servant of God marked by deep scars, yet with a restored heart. And every time I remember how I first found him, dirty, with an unkempt beard, sitting in front of that closed coffee shop, I get emotional, because the world saw a homeless man, but God saw a prince, and his vision is always higher, truer, and filled with purpose. My life changed completely when I chose to listen to the voice of the Spirit and step out of my comfort zone. I traded the stability of a marketing empire for the uncertainty of trusting daily in God's provision. But in return, I received something no business contract could ever offer: peace. Not the kind of peace the world gives, but the peace of knowing I am exactly where God wants me to be, loving, serving, and opening doors for others to live their own transformation. If I had to sum up this journey in one sentence, I would say, God chooses us not for who we are, but for what He can do through us. And if you're hearing my story today, maybe God is calling you too, to see with the eyes of faith, because there are princes hidden in the gutters, there are queens among the rejected, and there are incredible stories waiting for someone willing to love the way Christ loved. I'm living proof of that, and you can be too. Now that you've heard my story, tell me, how many people have you dismissed just by looking at them? How many times have you rushed past someone God wanted you to see with your heart? The truth is, many times the miracle we ask for is disguised as a challenge we avoid. But what if your next life breakthrough is right behind that step of faith you've been too afraid to take? If today you feel like something needs to change, that your routine is empty or your heart feels dry, ask God for new eyes. Ask Him to help you see as He sees, because that's exactly what happened to me. I'm Annie Vaughn, and I found a place here on the Faith Story channel to share this transformation. And it wasn't just a love story. It was a mission born out of the improbable. If this testimony touched you, subscribe to the channel now. Here, every story glorifies God and shows that He still writes new beginnings. And if you have a testimony too, why not share it in the comments? Your story might be the answer someone is praying to find. God used my life. He can use yours too.